Hi, it's Chris Titley here. On this week's episode of Scoreboard, I'm joined by Ron Shell, CEO of NPL, the National Pickleball League. Ron, thank you so much for being part of this series.
No, thank you for having me on, Chris. Excited to talk about pickleball.
Ron, you are the first esteemed guest as CEO. So far on Scoreboard, we've had 35 athletes talking about their stories and their different sports. But today, a little different, which is great. The CEO of the National Pickleball League. I just wanted to know, Ron, firstly, about the NPL and secondly, about pickleball in general.
Well, look, that is our challenge at the NPL. It's not just about growing the NPL. We need to play probably the driving force in growing a new sport. And probably a new sport with aspirations of a sport that we haven't seen in the modern era. You know, there's been a lot of new sports and there's a lot of niche sports, but where pickleball wants to go is to be probably the most participated sport in the world. So there's a huge journey ahead there, and a lot of it starts with education, Chris. So happy to start there.
Yeah, no, for sure. And the game itself, the origins, and again, the presence in Australia and the popularity in Australia. I'd love the listeners to understand a little bit about that.
Yeah, so let's take a step back to the quick history of pickleball. It actually was invented in the USA in 1965 in Washington State in a little island called Bainbridge Island by a guy called Joel Pritchard. And for a while, it was thought that the reason the sport was called pickleball, which is a unique aspect of it, that it has, a pretty silly name, was that because the guy's dog was called Pickles. It's since been proven that the dog came after the sport. So the dog was named after the sport. The reason it was called pickleball is essentially the origins of the sport is that it's a mismatch of a variety of racket sports. It's a bit of badminton, a bit of table tennis, and a bit of tennis. And so this guy had all of those rackets and balls in his house, and he sort of put it all together to create the first version of pickleball, which is a mini tennis or a big table tennis. It's played on 60% size court of a tennis court, the exact same dimension as badminton. It's played with more like a carbon fiber paddle, so no strings, and a plastic wiffle ball with a tennis net that's slightly lower than a net. So once again, a big table tennis, mini tennis. And the reason it was called pickleball is because back in the day, when you took crews on ships that were a mismatch of all different ships, they were the leftover crew. They were called the pickle crew. And so it was the leftovers of all these different sports. And he's like, well, I'm going to call it pickleball. And that was how the sport started. And to be honest, the history there is that it was really a niche sport for the first 55 years. Where it was only played by a small percentage of people, largely played in retirement homes because it is an easier sport to pick up, so it can still be played by an older demographic. And what happened in 2020, obviously we know what happened with COVID, is people were looking for an exercise or activity and something social. And it just started to pick up steam in the US because of that. And then two things happened. Firstly, there were people that invested heavily in infrastructure. So previously it was played on multi-surface lines, wooden surfaces. They then built dedicated courts that looked good, and then they marketed it to a younger demographic with content, marketing, etc. And from there, you went from 3 or 4 million people playing in the year 2000 to last year, 50 million people played the sport in the US. So it became ahead of cycling and running, Chris, in terms of participation. Which is crazy. And then I guess that was the impetus. I actually was living in the US to go and say, hey, can we do the same and follow a similar journey maybe 3 years on and bring the sport to Australia in a big way? It already existed, but in a smaller way. How do we market and bring a brand to Australia that can actually grow the sport using the same principles that happen in the US?
Fantastic. So a 55-year overnight success story, right? So
Exactly.
if you're an investor, you're cashing in now, and year 56, 57, your patience is the ultimate word there. But in saying that, the success and the rapid growth of it and the younger demographic, is it still played by the older demographic, or have you got some figures on who is playing it?
Absolutely. So up until a few years ago when we entered the market in Australia, the average age in Australia was still about 57. And we personally at the NPL now, our average age is closer to 35, which is a byproduct of how we're marketing the sport. But it is still played by all the demographics. And I think that's the beauty of it, is that we'll run in our centre, for example, in South Melbourne, here in Victoria, masters sessions, which is 45 plus on Monday, Wednesday, Fridays. Just before then, there might be kids coming in. And then after that might be a pickleball and Prosecco night. And so it is all those demographics. What I'll say in the US, which is where it's number one, the number one demographic now is 18 to 30, but there still is a high 50 plus demographic as well. So it's just started to skew differently, but we haven't lost those groups of players playing it. We've just added to the 50 plus demographic.
And in terms of the timing of the game and the scoring and the participants, can you talk about the different varieties there?
Yeah. Absolutely. So the scoring that's done, the traditional scoring of pickleball is actually like old volleyball scoring, whereby you only win points on your serve, and it's first to 11, win by 2. So pickleball can be played singles or doubles. Doubles is played the most, and it's the gateway to the sport. So 80% of pickleball really is doubles. It's the easier version. You don't have to cover as much of the court. And essentially, you only score points, when you're serving, and you get one chance to serve. There's no fault. So if you keep winning points on your serve, you'll continue to serve, and your score goes up. If you lose a point on your serve, the score doesn't change. Your partner then gets to serve. If they lose a point on their serve, it then goes to the other team. So essentially, everyone gets one chance to keep serving the whole match, but you sort of move along either your partners or the opposition team. And you only get your score counting up if you were the serving team and you won that point. From there, some of the very quick rules, Chris, is that you serve underarm. It's not overarm like tennis. It's still cross court. And you need to let the return bounce. You can't serve and volley like in tennis. But once the return bounces, it's very similar to tennis in that you're just playing over a net. You're trying to get it over. You're trying to hit winners. Except there is this very key part of pickleball different to tennis, which is called the kitchen or the non-volley zone, which is about 2.2 meters from the net. It's an area where you're not allowed to volley from in there because what would happen is you'd end points very quickly because it's a smaller court. So you have to be 2.2 meters behind or outside of the kitchen to volley. You're only allowed in there to half volley if the ball bounces in there. So 3 main rules: underarm serving, can't serve and volley, and you're not allowed to volley from within this designated zone called the kitchen or the non-volley zone. And then otherwise, I really liken it personally to a big table tennis where it's easier to pick up. You're still moving around. So it's like life-size table tennis. And I think that's what makes it such an accessible sport. It doesn't have that huge learning curve that tennis can have. That can be really daunting as a racket sport to pick up.
No, for sure. And there's a little bit of kids' school handball in there as well, instead of some of the rules as well. Like I've played handball with my kids and, the serve thing and the rotation around, etc.
Exactly. And I think with that's probably the most complex part of it. It's supposed to be a really simple sport to pick up. So it's funny, even when we run events, like we run large corporate events at our facilities, sometimes we'll just ignore some of the rules, like, hey, you can score on every point, or all of these things that are somewhat the complex parts. But once you pick it up, and if it's a smaller group, you obviously get the hang of it. It's probably that first bit where it's like, this is unique to this sport. This isn't the same as table tennis and explaining that. But all the other rules and how to pick it up are pretty simply are the essence of the sport.
And Ron, Scoreboard is about the intersection of business and sport, and you've come back from the US and wanting to do something in Australia. Can you talk about your journey, I suppose, that light bulb moment to go, actually, there's something really here?
Absolutely. So for me, very quickly, my background before NPL was I spent 7 years at the sports betting company PointsBet, which I was the first employee there, luckily enough. So I was working at Ernst & Young before then in audit, which I wasn't suited to. And I realized very quickly I might be interested in the startup world. And through connections, I was able to land the first role in this company that was very much figuring it out and trying to see where they would go in an existing sports wagering market. But lucky enough that coming at the right time, right place, I was thrust into a lot of responsibility and was able to be there pretty much from the start to see a company grow from nothing. There were 5 of us to when I left, there were 1,200 people worldwide, and we were operating in US, Canada, and Australia at the same time. And part of that journey was they sent me along with the US CEO to start the US side of the business once sports betting was legalized in 2018. And so we went over as PointsBet Australia, started PointsBet USA, and I was lucky enough to live in New York and then in Denver, Colorado. And while I was there in Denver in that last year or two, when I'd already decided that, it was 7 years was enough, it was an intense sort of startup environment. I loved every second of it, but it was time to explore new opportunities, I started to get invited to play pickleball. And I was as curious as everyone. What is this sport? Sounds weird. I've already got enough sports. And I actually decided not to play for the first 6 months. Now I'm so heavily involved in it. But I looked at YouTube videos and I didn't think that I wanted to play this sport. But when I finally did agree, what was interesting to me, Chris, is that I played it with people that normally aren't sports obsessed. So they weren't the people that loved NBA or NFL or AFL like I do. They were people that were just looking for something to do that they could actually do as a group, and fitness and wellness and social. And when I walked off with them, it wasn't necessarily at that moment. I had the light bulb moment. It was probably a few months later. But I remember them talking about pickleball with a pride that they never talked about sport before. You know how you have some friends that are obsessed with sport and some that aren't. And you literally, with the ones that aren't, they don't actually want to talk about sport. You have to talk about everything else with them. These were the friends I was playing pickleball with. And so fast forward a few months later, I moved back to Australia. I'm starting to look at, like a lot of people do when they move from overseas back home, it's like, hey, what was done well in my region that I saw professionally that I could potentially do back now that I'm back in my hometown. And so I wrote a list of 10 things. And there was 2 things I was looking into out of those 10. One of them was paddle, which is the other fastest growing racket sport in the world, big in Europe and South America. And the other one was pickleball. And pickleball I'd been exposed to, and I'd seen this growth, and it started to realize, hey, why has this sport done it? And that's why I started to do research into it. And then when I looked into the Australian scene, all the photos were of people 60 plus. They were grainy photos. It was played on hardwood floors with netball and badminton and basketball lines. I'm like, this is not how the sport's going to grow. If it's going to grow, and that's still an if, it needs to be marketed better. And so the vision there was, hey, let's create a league that focuses on creating a pathway eventually, but actually is masquerading as a brand. We are trying to modernize the sport, make it more accessible, and bring it to Australia and market it better. And that's what was done well in the US. Like any good idea, I'm just taking something else and modifying it to a different market and a slightly different audience. But with the proof points that, hey, there are a lot of similarities in how we consume sport and pop culture. If it can work in the US, I think we can make it work in Australia. And so, yeah, we started the National Pickleball League December 2022, me and three others, and then went full-time really from April 2023 and raised our first set of capital in July 2023, and it all started from there.
Well, that's brilliant. And in terms of the startup mentality as well, there's obviously a lot of moving parts. So you're kind of a startup in your own right. I'm wondering whether there's a sort of an inclination, like in the early 90s or so, there was a lot of Australians that had tennis courts in their houses, whether that's going to be a trend soon, but people can have pickleball courts in their houses.
Well, I think so. And we've started to see a lot of residential inquiries come through, and it's smaller. Once again, you don't have to have as big a space, or for every tennis court, you can fit 3 pickleball courts, and 4 if you really wanted to. We recommend 3 to have the right sizing. What I'll say, Chris, in the US, it has become a phenomenon, and it's actually created a bit of controversy because pickleball is louder than tennis. The pop of the paddle versus the plastic hitting onto carbon fiber creates a lot of noise compared to a tennis ball on string. And so there's already been a lot of council disputes around that. And technology is trying to improve and reduce the sound of pickleball paddles and balls. But there's a stat I read sometime last year where Airbnbs that have a pickleball court can now charge 60% more than other Airbnbs in the exact same area.
There you go.
So there you go.
You're all over it, Ron, in terms of the housing and in regards to the stakeholders involved in terms of the growth. You've got people like governments, I'd imagine, that are implementing pickleball courts or can implement pickleball courts. You've got corporates that may want to get involved. You've got the individuals. There's a lot of moving parts and people that you're talking to. How have you gone with the progression of the NBL in terms of getting it to a stage where you're happy with and then that next level of explosive growth?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing there that you touched on is around like governments and that thing, and that actually hasn't properly happened yet. So some background for you and the listeners, pickleball is still not recognised as an official sport in Australia. Now, most people don't go and look up those things anyway, and if they see the NPL and all these things happening, like they just assume that it is a sport. But the Australian Sporting Commission needs to recognise a governing body for a sport to then be recognised as an official sport. And no one has been recognised just yet because it is still so new. There's a company, business called Pickleball Australia Association, who we have a partnership with that are trying to be the governing body. They're the acting governing body right now. They're also quite new. They were in 2018. But what it's meant, Chris, and where I'm getting to is we actually haven't seen much government funding or any funding into the sport. Largely, it's all been private, and that's been largely driven by us. And therefore, it's probably been a double-edged sword. We've been able to move at a pace that we probably could never move at if there was an established sport and established frameworks and funding going to X, Y, and Z. And what we've done in 18 months, we would never be able to do in another sport, which has been amazing for the NPL. On the flip side, we've carried a huge burden where, to your point, you need more council-driven courts. You need more funding into the sport that can build the clear pathways from education and schools. That hasn't happened, but we believe that this year, and at very latest next year, there will be a governing body awarded. And that usually happens. Those applications open in April. It's decided at some point in the second half of the year. From there, we've already started to engage with stakeholders in government and others. People are starting to really know about the sport. But I think once it gets that official designation, that's when you'll start to see this, I hate to use the term, but hockey stick growth, where we've gone from 20,000 participants in Australia 2 years ago to just under 100,000, which is great growth. It just overtook squash last year, which is, I know, a dying sport, but still, pickleball was nothing. We want to get to 1 million participants by 2028. To do that, we could do everything within our power, and we probably would get close, but we wouldn't get there. We need the government to come behind it, and I see that happening over the next 12 months. One of the things that did happen, Chris, is Tennis Australia finally decided to get involved, and we have a close relationships with them, but they ran the first ever pickleball tournament at a tennis Grand Slam at the Australian Open earlier this year. So that was the first time that any Grand Slam around the world ran a pickleball tournament, when for the last few years, pickleball and tennis have actually feuded a tiny bit. But now a lot of the smarter tennis-focused people are like, hey, we can't keep fighting against this. This is going to happen whether we like it or not. They're just going to take all of our courts. So why don't we try to control that somewhat and, maybe create racket centers of excellence, all these different things. But a great starting point was Tennis Australia put on an Australian Open pickleball slam on Show Court 3 during the last 3 days of the Australian Open this year.
That's very forward-thinking from tennis, and I'd assume you did mention earlier in the podcast around it's like 60% of a tennis court, so I would assume that some people can use existing tennis courts to play pickleball?
Which is very common. So to mark up multi-lines, which is the preference. Now, our preference at NPL is that no sport that has any premium status or is considered, a top sport is played on multi-lines. You have your own dedicated courts, but as a starting point, you can take a tennis court and multi-line 3 courts there, which is definitely starting to be done around the country. And, that is the easiest way to pretty much overnight, you could do with tape, is to create pickleball courts out of tennis courts. And what a lot of existing tennis facilities have done is they've used that as a test. And then from there, they've then gone, cool, well, this is great. We actually don't use one of these tennis courts at all during the day. Yeah, it's packed at night, but it just sits there dormant. So why don't we turn that one into 3 pickleball courts, and then they add a second and make it 6? And what we're finding is a lot of these centres, and they often come to us now as the, I guess, 4 leaders in pickleball, they want to know about the revenues and whether they can get people through the day. But we're seeing a lot of centres are starting to figure out that don't need to get rid of all your tennis courts. There is a happy world where tennis and pickleball can coexist, but you probably have some of these tennis courts sitting there not making you any revenue for a large portion of your week. You can flip that. You can add 3 revenue streams to one. You can then double the revenue on each of those individual revenue streams by just making a call to get rid of, something that obviously is a big part of the fabric in Australia, but you still keep tennis courts for those that are playing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And a number of schools have tennis courts too. So therefore, if you start getting the kids playing, wanting to play the sport when they leave school, then they're like already familiar. We've played for 5 years, etc., and I'm pretty good. Yep. And that's on that topic in terms of being pretty good. Firstly, are tennis players good at pickleball? And secondly, I suppose if you are good at it, where can you go and what can you do?
Well, that's you've come to the perfectly right place. So I'll answer the second question first and then the first question, because a big part of what we're doing by creating professional pathways is also recruiting people to the sport. And so at the National Pickleball League, we have a professional tour that has two sections to it. You have traditional tournaments, which people would be used to in tennis, where you have singles and doubles formats, except singles, doubles, and mixed doubles are equally as popular. And so we run those standalone tournaments. For example, we've already one run in Sydney this year, and we're running 6 total with $300,000 of prize money, which I'll get back to in a second. Secondly, we have our professional teams league, which is the NPL. That is 18 teams across New South Wales, Queensland, and Victoria with 4 players per team, and 24 players per state, 72 total professional players. And so as a good player, that is your pathway, is you can be drafted. We hold a draft, so it isn't that everyone can apply, but we pre-select captains and they draft in a snake draft format. However, anyone can play in the tournaments. However, we do cap the brackets at certain numbers based on the limitations of the centres we're playing. What we've found, Chris, is tennis on the professional side, I'd say 60 to 70% of the best players have a tennis background, if not higher. It does
not
translate
squash,
really well. Squash as well, racquetball. Yep. Tennis is the most common, but any racket sport, you can then get a bit of a head start on the pickleball side. And so some of our very best players, nearly all of them, have some sort of tennis background, and often quite a high one. However, the beauty of the sport is you don't necessarily need to be a top 200, 400, 600 former player. You know, if you're in the top 2,000, 4,000, 5,000, still a very handy player. That probably translates enough. What's interesting, however, is that tennis translates really well to the singles aspect of pickleball, but doubles is a lot more strategy, finesse, specific to pickleball, that we see it all the time. These gun tennis players come in, they take really big scalps, like beat some of the best singles pickleball players, and they get beaten comprehensively in their first few months in doubles. But once they figure it out, they become these multi-talented players. But on the grassroots, which is where I think the true commercial value lies in pickleball, you obviously need a professional league, and for people to think, hey, cool, it's cool that there's professionals playing. On the grassroots side, really, racket sports are not required to get started. And I think that's been where there's been such a success, because you have people that would not be able to play nearly any other racket sport from reasons of health or fitness, athleticism, coordination, that are still able to play pickleball. So pro side, tennis player certainly helps. Otherwise, yeah, it helps obviously if you're social playing, but you certainly don't need it as a prerequisite.
And Ron, from the US and seeing the people that have succeeded in pickleball, and you know, I can name most people can name tennis players as household names, both male and female, etc. How close are you to sort of recognizing those people? They're out there, they're doing it for a profession, they're making X amount of dollars, yep, I suppose, as a professional pickleball, yep, player, and then to get that sort of younger generation demographic using content as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the US, which I always say the US is about 3 years ahead of where Australia is, because they started moving things. 2022 was a big year, then 3 and 4, and we're sort of 3 years behind that in terms of trajectory. But I'll list some tennis players for you now that are professional pickleball. Jack Sock, who was a top 10 player, he's a top 20 player in pickleball. And through endorsements and contracts, earns quite a bit. Eugenie Bouchard,
yep,
who had a good run. She's now a professional pickleball player, very marketable as well. And there's plenty of others that have made the switch. Now, in the same vein, that's been even what tennis players in Australia have looked at and go, wow, if Jack Sock, Eugenie Bouchard, Isner, Sam Querrey, and a few others are making it, then this is cool now. Like, I don't have to be embarrassed to make the switch over. And so we use that as a carrot, and we also try to market the sport so well that it looks premium. And even the people that we speak to, they always tell me the same things. For 6 months, they were just monitoring it. They didn't actually want to tell their tennis friends that they're making the switch to the smaller, little cousin. But once they started to see the marketing coming about that other players are doing it, and then here's the kicker, Chris, the prize money they can earn in pickleball immediately is so much more than what you can earn in tennis, unless you're a top 200 player in the world, which there's 200 people. So we had a great example is we had a guy called Tom Evans who made it as high as maybe 800 in the world in tennis. He came over and in his first year probably made 20, 30, 40,000 in prize money. in the National Pickleball League, and we're in our first couple of years of running. And so comparing to where they would have spent, and almost most players lost money because they had to travel to Europe
and hotels
and things, they're suddenly able to make more of a living from pickleball overnight. And once you have that message, it looks good. It's still really fun and competitive sport, and there's those pathways. It's still a huge journey that we're undertaking, where we are still needing to convince a lot of players to come into the sport, but it's getting easier and easier the more that you convince, because they become advocates that spread the word for you. And we're 2 years and a bit into that journey. 2 or 3 years from now, I won't need to sell the sport. The sport will be selling itself.
Yeah, and on that, with the players that are succeeding and the players that are obviously posting about it and they're talking about the game, and then on the other side, you've got the sponsors that may want to be a part of it. Can you talk about some of the sponsors that have helped you along the journey? And then as they improve, you probably get something like broadcast rights, then you get things like higher prize money and the sort of compound flywheel effect.
Exactly. And it is a bit of chicken and egg, unfortunately, with a new sport where, we're a startup company. We're probably transitioned past that, but you need to spend to attract the types of sponsors that you want. But then as well, like, the sport is where it's at. So you want to spend equally to where the participation and the money is in the sport. So it's a difficult balance. But I feel like we've tried to get that right, probably better than most companies where they overspend early going, we'll get that money back in 5 years, or ones that are too conservative. And what we've tried to do is be very smart about that, and realize, to your point, however, that we could run tournaments and all these things and the sport will grow, but so incremental and slow. The easiest way to grow a sport is to get larger partners on board who already have a megaphone and community that is 100x your size. And so I think the biggest thing we did...
There you go. There's a sponsor on the line right now. This is an authentic podcast where we're right in the middle of it all.
Yeah, exactly. They're calling
You better take it. It's the CEO of... I won't say the company, sorry.
Well, look, I'll dive into what... So we started getting, interest from pickleball-specific companies to begin with, which is very obvious. But where things change is when non-endemic partners get involved. And the biggest one we got involved was July last year, AHM, health insurance. They've got just under 1 million members, obviously have, a big sort of community, a wellness aspect to them, and they come on board as the official sponsor of the NPL. And not only are they putting media behind that, they're also now offering a perk to their 1 million members that is a 6-month NPL membership. So suddenly we can go out to a database we wouldn't be able to hit through a commercial partner that is paying us for sponsorship. And it's a huge win-win where they can add value to their existing base. They can say that they're, directly with a growing sport. They said to me word for word, the decision to partner with you is we can spend X with you, or we could do Y 30-second TV commercials. Which one are we going to get more from? And can we get the same price we can get to sponsor the NPL now than we would in 3 years from now? Probably not, if we believe in your trajectory and the sports trajectory. So AHM came on board, which has been great. And then since then, some interesting ones that are Franklin Sports is a big sports company. They have a pickleball arm. They've come on board, but also international companies. So Asia is a growing market for pickleball in the last year. And the airline Vietjet, which is the largest airline in Vietnam, they just signed on as a major sponsor. And that's crazy to think that they're a Vietnam-based company sponsoring a new sports league in Australia. But it shows, if you believe, which they do, Vietnam has the highest courts per capita in Asia currently, and India and China, Malaysia, Singapore are also investing heavily. If you believe the sport's going to grow in your region and that region, there is this benefit to find these commercial partners. So what we need, Chris, is more of those non-endemic large sponsors who are willing to then go out to their audience. And so suddenly we're doing the exact same things, but overnight we can look like geniuses because we've gone out to 1 million people instead of 10,000 people. So it is a really critical thing to that point. And then from there, broadcast. So we are investing in our own broadcast, which we currently push to YouTube. We've called it Green Zone. I don't know if you follow the NFL and Red Zone, but it's something I loved when I was living there. And I just thought it was a great way to get a casual fan into the sport who doesn't want to watch 4 hours of NFL with commercial after commercial after commercial. So we're trying to create that with pickleball. I don't know if long-term pickleball is going to be watched by the casual fan if it's just 3-4 hours of straight pickleball. But we have 9 games happening around the country in our professional league. Can we take the best bits of that and add commentary and add instant replay to that, can that be a long-term viable broadcast product? I think that's the best chance that we'll have. And so that's where we're investing in there. We're investing X amount of money, but making it look as good as possible so sponsors take interest, then we can invest more and, to your point, eventually sell those broadcast rights when it makes sense.
Yeah, I've seen some of those commentary wraps on Instagram. They're very good. The names and the team names are pretty good and pretty synonymous with other sort of organisations, and I think that's important to kind of go, actually, I know this team, or I'm following this team, or I'm following that player, for instance, which I think what the kids do as well when they look up on the posters and the trading cards and all those things to come. But you are a newish style business. You're a newish style sport. How important is to get the technology, the infrastructure, and the communication right early, so people don't sort of feel like, I don't know where to start. The registration sign-ups are really hard. It's clunky. I don't really like this.
Yeah, I think that's the hardest thing to balance as any startup, is that, there is that balance between getting everything perfect and the user journey perfect to just going out and doing things. Because you can, overthink things and miss your opportunity. I think, to your point, one of the things that was a challenge for us in the first year is that, where can I find the information? And even now, that's not perfect. Is where can I find where to play? Where can I find where to send my kid to play? Where can I find coaching? Where can I find the league results that I've seen some Instagram stuff on? We're doing a much better job on that, and that's a huge focus for us this year, is standardizing that information, making it very available, providing a lot more of that framework. There's more to play in that space, and you'll find people's friction points. There's two of them. One is there's still not enough centers. So people get excited. They hear about pickleball. They listen to this podcast. Their favorite reality TV show mentions pickleball. They go and search, and there's not a center close enough to them. They lose interest. They're out of the funnel. The second one is maybe there is a center close or whatever, but there's still unanswered questions or things like that. And what gets them over the line is actually that a friend went to play and they saw it on their social media. And so I think what we've realized is the power of having, a strong online presence, and then also having a really good flow once you finally do get people into your funnel, i.e. our venue, which was the first thing we invested in Melbourne, and we're about to expand to Sydney and Brisbane as well. Is really important because it's new and people can lose interest right away and go back to what they're comfortable with. Oh, no, I knew all these other sports. I know exactly where to play it. I know exactly how it works. So that first time experience and then feeling proud about it, to that point, will I share it? Do I think this looks cool enough for me to share this new thing? Yes, that's what we try to make. And if they do, then people will come to our website. If the website looks premium, then they'll stay and they'll navigate. And if they can find enough information there, then perhaps they'll take the sport and the NPL seriously. And so you're right. One of the areas I think that we, like any company, needed to work through in our first year is we ran these tournaments, we were running all these great events, but we were losing people on the journey because they're like, well, cool, where do I play? How do I find this? And it wasn't that clear. We've improved that. I'd say we're 60% of where we need to be. Once we get to closer to 100%, you'll start to see the incremental flow-ons is just when you have a good user journey, people will find places to play and they'll play it regularly.
And I think, Ron, in terms of the success of some sports, you've got cricket, which was a 5-day game. They've turned it into a 2020 product. You've got innovations within the NFL. You've got innovations within the NRL with things like Golden Point, etc. How are you thinking about the game 5 years down the track, where there could be different things introduced? There could be a World Cup. There could be like a State of Origin product. There could be a whole lot of different things. What are you thinking around pickleball?
Yeah, so I'm pretty passionate about this because what is unique about pickleball is that I don't think, and look, we spend most of our time, energy and money on the professional side, but I don't think that's the pure beauty of the sport. And that presents a unique challenge in that I think it can be played by everyone. And to that point, there is something with that you then need to convince people, well, if it's so easy to play, why should I watch the professional side of it? So then you do need to innovate, to your point, really well around that. And I think what we found, and we've done testing, we've used our league as a testing ground, and we're getting much closer to the final product, is that singles compared to doubles is very similar in entertainment to tennis, in that there's athletic players. You can watch a singles game and you're like, I can't do that, which is sort of that feeling you want when you watch your best athletes, is you want to always feel like that is amazing. I'm watching something that the regular person can't do. With the problem with doubles, while it's so fun, sometimes you're watching a doubles point in pickleball and you're like, that is not impressive. You can't understand it until you've actually played at the highest level. So part of what we do differently is we focus a lot on singles. And then to that same point, I think, how do you move between singles, doubles? And that's the format we've created. Is it's not just about getting obsessed with yourself as a sport and being like, hey, people will watch a game to 11 or 21. No, let's move between the different formats. Let's create a teams format, to your point, that people can get behind their favorite players again. And it's driven by a team mentality, which we love in Australian sports. And then let's create a broadcast that actually jumps to the best parts of what's happening when it's close, when it's the best players. And I think that's where we're going to innovate. Is don't assume because we're going to get hopefully millions of people playing the sport, the millions of people want to watch it. Actually assume the opposite. You need to create a sport that is playable by millions and then watchable by X percent. But when the X percent finally do decide to watch, they don't turn off quickly. So that is one of the challenges in the US, if I'm honest, is that they've achieved 50 million participants and in the hundreds of thousands of viewers. And that delta is something that from day one, I was pretty passionate. How do we try to at least innovate in that area so that we can at least give ourselves the best chance for success there?
Yeah, no, it's a very, very good conversation on that. I suppose in regards to a problem, but it's a good problem, and it'll solve itself out. You touched on that point around the participation rates. You touched on the point around people that haven't potentially played sport, the pool of people that play sport, and you're sort of getting a wider pool. Can you talk about the mental health benefits, and I suppose some stories that you've got from people that weren't playing sport, now playing it, going, actually, this has changed my life, you know?
It's probably the most common thing. And look, there's always hyperbole. You know, everyone loves a good story. But the amount of people that have fallen in love with pickleball because of the fact that it's created a completely new outlet and community for them that they now feel a purpose for again. I mean, there is a great feeling that comes with being okay at a sport. Being competent at a physical activity, you get so much benefit out of that. And you couple that with the fact that you can speak to your opponents and your teammates so easily. You're not, 20, 30 meters away. You're 2 meters away. You've suddenly created both the benefits of exercise and well-being with the ability to socialize in the moment, with the ability to socialize in the moment with more people than you could have previously because it has such a wide accessibility. So you've touched on 3 sort of key pillars of what people are looking for to do outside of going to the pub and getting a meal. That hits exercise, it hits socializing, and it hits, a level of achievement. And so you're able to do all those things, and the mental health benefits that come from that are very well documented. And so we've just seen people have found a sport that they can now play 3 or 4 times a week. That's probably been the most fascinating thing, is that this becomes, as soon as people get into our venue, like we have an over 60% return rate, which is crazy. And we have people that are coming 4 or 5 times a week. And that's because they found exactly that mental health and the physical benefits that they haven't been able to find with another activity. And we have a bar at our facility. So you can sit there and have a drink after. Pickleball and Prosecco is our most popular event. It runs on Fridays and Saturdays. We don't even market it. People just come and want to play a bit of pickleball and want to have that free Prosecco and sit there in a nice setting. And I think that's what's found this amazing niche for pickleball, and why we believe in it so much is there's so many people that can play it together. You've got so many people in your internal community that you can now turn to and convince to play pickleball. And even the skeptics turn into, advocates. The problem we've found with nearly every other sport is tennis. If you're not playing someone who's as good as you, it becomes quite boring and difficult very early. Same with basketball. Same with anything. Lawn bowls was, very popular about 10 years ago. But the problem, once again, it is actually quite hard to get okay at it. It was great because you could have a few drinks and socialize, and it was barefoot. This takes lawn bowls to the next level because you can socialize and be okay at it quite quickly, but you also get the wellness and physical sort of mentality, and then you can play it indoors as well, rain, hail, or shine. So I think that's what's contributed to that mental aspect that people have definitely found.
And sorry, just on that topic, is it predominantly played indoors or outdoors?
Predominantly outdoors to begin, but we're passionate about indoor centres, and that's what's really changed the sport. Like, we opened the first indoor centre in Australia, in Melbourne, and that's what we're looking to do in each major city. The reason for that is that obviously the elements stop the sport being played, but also the wind. Even in nice days, the wind impacts. It's a plastic ball. It's not a tennis ball, so it weighs a lot less. So even the lightest amount of wind can have a huge impact. And so the beauty of the sport being indoors in the centres that are starting to open up now that we sort of started the floodgates is that you can play them 24/7. And it is such a great sport for so many demographics that the daytime, which is traditionally a quiet time for rec centres, is also busy for us as well. But I'd say the outdoors is more popular. It's cheaper. It can be council driven. Indoors is going to require a lot of private investment. So it's been a bit of a slower burn.
And indoors, you can have that Prosecco, and then after a few Proseccos, you can talk about that shot that didn't happen, but everyone goes, "Oh, I remember that shot," right? And you can reminisce, right?
Correct.
Curious question: has there been any sort of like couples that have played socially that have ended up marrying each other?
Absolutely. There's a pickleball dating page in the US, Facebook page that has over 200,000 people in it. It is run clubs, Chris, 5 years ago was where you met your partners. They just masqueraded as fitness. They were actually dating clubs. The new one is pickleball. Everyone's saying it, but this is the easiest way to meet a partner is to meet them at one of these events. There's a few dating apps that came to us. One of them's called Hump Day. There's a big one called Thursday that run all over the world. They've run events or are about to run events at our facility because it has such a dating element. And we've had some of our professional players that end up meeting on the court, and we've turned that into a current affair stories, for example.
That's brilliant. Ron, one final question. I repeat this podcast with you in 3 years' time, right? And we're talking about the sport. Where would you like it to be?
Great question. I think 1 million is that number. We need to get to 1 million participants. We're at 100,000. So 10x in terms of participants. And I want the sport to be, actually one of the household sort of sports in Australia, not ahead of AFL, rugby, cricket, but sitting in probably in that second pack where people are really passionate and have fallen in love with it. Because if you can crack the Australian sporting crowd, you've done a really good job. And then I think to the point you asked about the great stories and mental health, I think if it can become the cornerstone of what helps turn around a lot of the poor mental health that has happened since COVID in Australia and start to become, that foresight for, hey, here are hundreds, thousands of stories that have come from the number one participation sport in Australia, then we've done our job. And that's where I want to see it in 3 years.
Yep, and then in 7 years, we've got a little event happening here in Brisbane, which we're going to hear about on next week in regards to some stadium selections and some stadium constructions, etc. You think pickleball could make it eventually to the Olympics?
Absolutely. The only thing stopping it would be there 100% by 2032, is that there's a lot of people that have seen the commercial opportunity of pickleball and suddenly they created 5 different world governing bodies. Now, the IOC needs one, and that's the International Olympic Committee, and the reason for that is they just want to point to one set of rules, etc. Now, it will finally consolidate, but there's just a lot of people fighting internationally right now. As soon as that consolidation happens, it will be the next sport in the Olympics. So can it make 2032? I should be the person that says yes first, but I'm pretty realistic in that I think it's 50-50 because of the international space. However, if that solves itself, it moves to binary 100-0 almost overnight. I think 2036 is a certainty. I think 2032 is about 50-50. But I would love it to happen because, as you can appreciate, everything we do suddenly goes up 3x if it becomes an Olympic sport.
Ron Shell, thank you so much for giving us an understanding of pickleball, as also the NPL, the history, the origins of the game, the progress of the game, the excitement, the mental health benefits, so much happening in your world. Thank you so much for being part of the Scoreboard podcast series. Really look forward to following the progress of pickleball, following it on socials. One final question for someone that's interested, where do they start?
Go to www.mplpickleball.com.au and there's a where to play page that has not only our venues, but our partner venues. And then going to our Instagram, you're going to get that feeling and flavor that will inspire you to play at MPL Pickleball. So that would be where I'd start if you're new to the sport.
Fantastic, Ron. Thank you so much and looking forward to catching up.
Thanks, Chris. Looking forward to our first game as well when I'm up in Queensland.